Your favorite villain?
My favorite villain? I kind of like Diddy. I believe Cassie's a victim in all this because she came in as such, she's like 18, like 19 years old.
When the documentary ended, most people expected closure. 4 episodes, a major release, and a feeling that the story had finally been laid out from start to finish. That's usually how these moments work. The credits roll, the debate peaks, and then attention slowly moves on. But this time, that didn't happen. Instead of fading, the conversation stalled in a strange place. Not satisfied, not resolved, just paused. That pause is important because what people felt wasn't confusion, it was absence. The sense that certain moments were summarized instead of explored, that some questions were acknowledged but not walked through, and that the structure felt like it was setting boundaries rather than opening everything up. And that feeling didn't come from online rumors or exaggerated reactions. It came from the quiet realization that something was being held back. Then the conversation shifted, not because of a new headline, but because of a simple statement made after the release. A statement that didn't promise shock, didn't tease drama, and didn't accuse anyone of anything. It only suggested that not everything made it onto the screen, that some material existed beyond what viewers had seen. And once that idea entered the conversation, everything changed.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Kim Kardashian, all of them were Diddy's handlers. After watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Because when you learn that a story was shaped by limits, you stop watching it as a finished product. You start watching it as a frame. You replay scenes differently. You listen to answers more carefully. You notice where conversations end earlier than expected. And suddenly, what felt complete starts to feel like groundwork. That's how attention shifts from reaction to examination. And that's what's happening now. People aren't asking what was shown. They're asking why certain things were condensed, why some perspectives felt brief, and why the story seemed to stop right when it felt like it was opening up. Not because something explosive was promised, but because the tone suggested restraint, deliberate restraint. Right here, before we go any further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. This isn't the kind of story that moves fast, but it is the kind that keeps unfolding when people pay attention. What makes this moment different from other documentaries is timing. The material was released while events were still active, conversations still sensitive, and legal realities still shaping what could responsibly be included. That alone changes how stories are told. It forces structure. It forces edits. It forces decisions about what can be shown now versus what has to wait. So when someone close to the project says there's more, it doesn't automatically mean new accusations or shocking reveals. Often it means context that didn't fit yet, conversations that needed distance, details that only matter once the audience understands the full landscape. That's why this didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a line being drawn, a point where the audience was brought up to speed, but not taken all the way forward. And once people sensed that, they didn't move on. They leaned in. Because stories don't stay quiet when people realize they were only seeing part of the picture. And once that realization settles in, attention doesn't fade. It sharpens. That's why this moment matters. Not because of what was promised, but because of what was implied. Once that idea settled in, that not everything had been shown, the way people looked back at the documentary quietly changed. Scenes that once felt definitive started to feel selective. Interviews that sounded confident suddenly felt carefully framed, not misleading, just contained. And containment always raises the same question. What was the boundary? Because documentaries like this don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by time limits, legal review, platform standards, and strategic choices about pacing. That doesn't make them dishonest. It makes them incomplete by design. And when the person closest to the project acknowledges that reality, it reframes everything you've already watched. This is where attention shifts from content to construction. Viewers start noticing where the camera cuts away, where a thought is introduced but not followed, where a timeline jumps forward instead of lingering. Those are subtle choices, but they matter. Not because they hide something explosive, but because they signal restraint. And restraint only exists when there's more to say than can safely be shown at once. What's important here is that no one rushed to contradict this idea. There was no scramble to clarify. No long explanations insisting everything important had already been included. Just quiet acceptance that the story had limits. That silence didn't calm curiosity, it focused it. Because silence after a major release doesn't feel accidental. It feels intentional. People began asking smarter questions. Not what did they miss, but why would it matter later? Not what wasn't shown, but what wouldn't make sense yet. Those questions don't chase drama. They chase timing. And timing is everything in stories like this. You also have to consider how perspective changes once an audience is informed. Early on, viewers need orientation, context, structure. You don't overwhelm them with every thread at once. You give them a foundation. And once that foundation is set, you can revisit moments with more depth, more clarity, and more consequence. That's why the conversation didn't explode. It deepened. Instead of loud reactions, there was sustained attention. People rewatched. They compared notes. They looked at post-release comments with more care. And they noticed something else. How measured the language was. No hype, no countdowns. Just the quiet suggestion that the story wasn't finished being told. That kind of suggestion is powerful because it doesn't force belief, it invites patience. And patience is rare online. When an audience chooses to wait instead of move on, it means they sense coherence forming, a longer arc, something that can't be rushed without losing meaning. That's when a documentary stops being an event and starts being a reference point. The shift is subtle, but it's real. The story is no longer about reacting to what was shown. It's about understanding why the shape of the story matters, why certain things land now and others later, why some material gains relevance only after the audience knows where to look. That's how attention stays locked in without noise. And once that happens, the story doesn't need to promise anything. It just needs to continue being watched. As people sat with that realization, another layer started to surface. Not about missing scenes or unseen footage, but about timing. Why this story was told the way it was, and why it arrived when it did. Because timing isn't just a production detail, it's part of the message. When a documentary drops while events are still unfolding, every choice becomes strategic. What you include now shapes public understanding. What you hold back isn't erased, it's delayed. And delay changes meaning. A detail that feels overwhelming early on might feel clarifying later. A conversation that sounds vague today might land with precision once the audience understands the full landscape. That's why this release felt careful, not cautious, careful. You could feel it in the pacing, in how moments were allowed to speak without being pushed, in how the narrative avoided conclusions and focused instead on alignment, what we know, what we've seen before, and where things stand right now. That approach doesn't aim to close a story. It prepares people to recognize it when it continues. And that's the part many viewers are picking up on instinctively. Because if the goal were shock, the tone would have been different. If the goal were spectacle, the framing would have leaned harder. Instead, what we got was groundwork, a shared reference point, something solid enough that future conversations won't feel disconnected or confusing. That's how long-form storytelling works when it's built to last. And another thing people noticed was how restrained the language around certain moments felt. Not evasive, intentional. The kind of restraint that suggests awareness of how much weight certain information carries and how easily it can be misunderstood without the right context. That kind of awareness doesn't disappear after release. It usually signals that context is still being developed, which explains why the post-release conversation didn't turn chaotic. There were no wild follow-ups, no dramatic reversals, just a steady acknowledgement that the story wasn't finished being shaped. And that steadiness matters because it shows confidence, not in one version of events, but in the process of telling the story responsibly over time. This is where audience trust gets built. When viewers sense they're not being rushed, they don't rush away. They stay. They listen. They allow the story to unfold instead of demanding instant answers. And once that trust forms, the narrative gains depth without needing volume. That's what's happening now. People aren't refreshing feeds looking for leaks or headlines. They're paying attention to how the story breathes, to how statements are phrased, to what's emphasized and what's left open-ended. That kind of attention is rare, and it doesn't happen unless the audience believes there's purpose behind the restraint. Because restraint only makes sense when something meaningful is being protected, not hidden, but timed. And once people start seeing the story through that lens, they stop asking when it ends. They start asking how it continues. As this understanding settled in, people started noticing something else, how differently this story was being treated compared to others like it. Usually, once a high-profile documentary drops, there's a wave of commentary. Everyone rushes to respond. Statements get issued. Defenses get drafted. Lines are drawn quickly so narratives don't drift out of control. That didn't happen here. Instead, there was distance. Not case, not denial. Distance. And distance is rarely accidental when powerful stories are involved. It's a sign that people are watching before they speak, measuring before they move. That alone tells you this story isn't being viewed as finished business. Because when a story is truly over, reactions are easy. What makes this moment heavier is that reactions feel delayed on purpose, as if everyone understands that what was shown is only one layer, and responding too quickly could lock them into a position before the full picture is visible. That kind of hesitation doesn't come from confusion. It comes from awareness. Awareness that context is still forming. And context is dangerous when it starts connecting dots instead of isolating moments. One clip alone doesn't change much. One interview can be explained away. One headline fades fast. But when information is structured to be revisited, when it's designed to be reinterpreted later, that's when pressure quietly builds. That's what people are sensing now. The first release didn't overwhelm the audience. It oriented them. It gave them reference points, names, timelines, familiar ground, so that when new information enters the conversation later, it doesn't feel random. It feels anchored. This is how long narratives gain power. Not by dumping everything at once, but by training the audience on how to read the story, what to pay attention to, where to notice patterns, how to recognize when something doesn't quite line up. Once viewers learn that language, you don't need to shout. You just need to continue. That's why even silence feels louder now. Because silence after groundwork has been laid doesn't mean avoidance. It means calculation. It means people are waiting to see what matters next before committing themselves publicly. And that kind of waiting changes the energy around a story. It stops being entertainment. It starts feeling consequential. You can feel it in the way conversations are framed now. Less speculation, more observation, less "did you see this?" and more "did you notice that?" That shift means the audience isn't chasing moments anymore. They're tracking movement. And once an audience starts tracking movement, the story stops needing constant updates to stay alive. It sustains itself through anticipation alone. That's where this stands right now. Not paused, not concluded, just positioned. And once a story reaches that position, the next step doesn't need to be loud to be felt. At this point, something subtle but important starts happening to the audience. They stop treating the documentary like a one-time watch and start treating it like a reference, a point they return to, a baseline for future understanding. That shift changes everything. Because once a story becomes a reference, it gains weight over time instead of losing it. People begin connecting how the documentary was framed with how conversations around it evolve. They notice which topics are revisited publicly and which ones quietly disappear. They notice who seems comfortable letting the story sit and who seems careful not to engage with it at all. None of that proves anything, but it does reveal awareness. And awareness is the real currency here. When a story truly has no future, people move on without hesitation. They joke about it. They summarize it. They package it into a takeaway and file it away. That hasn't happened here. Instead, the tone around this story remains restrained, measured, almost suspended. Suspension is powerful because suspended stories create anticipation without promising payoff. They don't exhaust attention, they conserve it. Every time someone references the documentary, they do so cautiously, as if aware that what they say now might not age well later. That tells you something. It tells you that the narrative space is still open, that people understand additional context could shift how early reactions are viewed. And when people act with that kind of caution, it usually means they don't believe the final shape of the story has been revealed yet. This is also where perception starts to matter more than information. Not because facts are unimportant, but because interpretation changes once the audience understands the structure of a story. Once viewers realize that some things were intentionally paced, they stop demanding immediacy and start valuing sequence. Sequence changes meaning. A detail shown early feels different than the same detail revisited later. A comment made before awareness lands differently once awareness is widespread. That's why stories like this don't peak at release. They stretch. And stretching keeps people watching. You can feel it in how carefully people speak now, in how often phrases like, "we'll see," "there's more," or "this isn't over" appear without anyone spelling out why. That kind of language isn't dramatic. It's defensive. Defensive of future context. Because once future context exists, past statements get reevaluated. That's what creates quiet pressure. No announcements, no countdowns, just the understanding that the timeline hasn't finished unfolding. And once that understanding takes hold, the audience doesn't drift away. They stay attentive, even in silence. That's where this story sits right now. Not building toward a single moment, but expanding outward. Waiting for the point where what's already been shown meets what's still being held. And when those two finally touch, everything people thought they understood will feel different. By now, the tension isn't coming from what's being said. It's coming from what's being left open. That's a deliberate shift, and the audience feels it, even if they can't immediately explain why. Stories usually try to close loops. They summarize, they reassure, they signal an ending so viewers can move on. This one doesn't. It leaves space, and space creates gravity. Because when a story refuses to close itself, people don't forget it. They carry it forward. They test new information against it. They listen differently when familiar names come up. They notice tone, timing, and who suddenly becomes careful with words. Care is revealing. You can tell when people sense that a narrative isn't finished. Conversations slow down. Reactions become measured. Nobody rushes to give definitive takes. That hesitation isn't confusion, it's calculation. The understanding that whatever is said now could be reinterpreted later. That's how long-form pressure works. It doesn't shock, it doesn't shout, it waits. And waiting changes the audience's role. Viewers stop being passive recipients and start acting like archivists. They remember details. They recall how something was framed months ago. They notice when explanations stop short or when familiar talking points quietly disappear. Disappearance is loud when you know what to listen for. This is also where the emotional rhythm of the story shifts. Early curiosity turns into patience. Patience turns into expectation. And expectation doesn't fade easily. It sharpens over time. Because expectation isn't about wanting drama. It's about wanting coherence. People don't need every answer immediately. They just need to believe answers exist. When that belief holds, attention stays anchored. When it doesn't, skepticism grows. Not angry skepticism, but thoughtful skepticism. The kind that doesn't react. The kind that observes. That's the most dangerous kind for any unfinished story. You can feel the audience leaning forward now. Not because something explosive has happened, but because something hasn't. No closure, no final word, no attempt to declare the story complete. And once viewers realize that's intentional, they stop asking, "What's next?" and start asking, "What fits where?" That question reframes everything. Moments that once felt isolated now feel connected. Silence starts to read as pacing instead of absence. Distance starts to look like strategy instead of coincidence. None of this requires new revelations to be effective. It only requires consistency, and consistency is exactly what people are testing for now. They're watching how the story behaves over time, whether it contracts or expands, whether it avoids or revisits, whether it settles or keeps breathing. Right now, it's still breathing, and as long as it does, the audience won't look away. At this stage, something subtle but powerful has already happened. The story no longer needs new information to stay alive. It's running on awareness now. When awareness takes over, every future moment becomes part of the narrative, whether anyone wants it to be or not. A pause feels intentional. A careful word choice feels calculated. A missing explanation feels heavier than any statement ever could. That's when the audience stops waiting for proof and starts watching behavior. Behavior tells you how confident a system really is. Confident systems explain, they contextualize, they close loops. Systems that rely on time and distance do something else entirely. They slow everything down and trust attention to drift away. But attention didn't drift this time. It settled. And settled attention changes how stories are consumed. Viewers are not reacting emotionally anymore. They're observing, comparing, remembering. They're noticing how often familiar patterns repeat under pressure. Silence, delay, careful framing, no definitive endings.